Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, our mission is, well, to cut through some of the noise, synthesize what's really happening globally right now. We're looking at everything from high-level military stuff to the pressures hitting your wallet.
Exactly. We're trying to connect the dots between sources that seem, worlds apart. Think nuclear claims from Russia on one side, and then the financial survival of governments, like, halfway across the globe.
And how does that actually translate into, well, pressure points for you, the listener?
That's the core question we're tackling.
Okay, so let's jump right in. We'll be unpacking these claims around Russia's supposed new nuclear missile. We'll look at the immediate and, frankly, pretty devastating costs of this economic experiment happening in Argentina.
And yes, we absolutely have to figure out why these low-altitude cigarette smuggling balloons are somehow causing airport chaos and international tension over in Eastern Europe. It sounds strange, but it's happening.
It really does. Okay, let's unpack this. Let's start with the big strategic power plays. High-stakes theater, really, around nuclear capability. Russia, specifically President Putin and General Gerasimov, they're claiming a successful test of the Burevestnik, that's the Storm Petrel missile, nuclear-capable cruise missile.
Yeah, and this test, it didn't happen in a vacuum, right? It came right after these massive strategic nuclear drills. We're talking their whole triad, ICBMs from land, a sub in the Barents Sea, strategic bombers, the works.
A full display of force, maximum deterrence is the message, I guess.
Pretty much, it's signaling. But the claims about the Burevestnik itself, that's where it gets really interesting. Gerasimov reported it flew 14,000 kilometers, 8,700 miles. And spent 15 hours in the air. 15 hours. And then he adds, that's not the limit.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, so what's Putin selling here?
Invulnerability. That's the pitch. He's claiming this thing has almost unlimited range and, this is key, an unpredictable flight path. Put those together, he argues, and it's basically invulnerable to any defense system we have now or might have in the future. They're already talking about prepping infrastructure for deployment.
So the headline isn't just test successful, it's we're changing the game. We can bypass missile defense.
That's the claim they're making, yes. A major strategic shift, if true.
Okay, so that's the, high-altitude, multi-billion-dollar threat.
Right.
But volatility isn't always about ICBMs, is it? Sometimes the disruption is, well, low-tech, asymmetric. Which brings us to Lithuania. They're dealing with suspected cigarette smuggling balloons coming over from Belarus. And these things are actually causing chaos at Vilnius Airport.
It's kind of fascinating, isn't it, how this works as a sort of non-military pressure. They're cheap devices, balloons, basically. The Lithuanian border guard chief says, as far as they know, they've only ever carried illegal cigarettes since they first saw them in 2023.
Only cigarettes.
Yeah. But the disruption,
Yeah.
It's completely out of proportion to, a pack of smokes.
Absolutely. The impact's been bad enough to trigger national security discussions. We saw flights suspended 2 nights in a row, one night, 4 cancellations, 7 diversions.
Yeah.
The very next night, 10 cancellations, 4 diversions.
Yeah.
I mean, that just paralyzes an airport.
And that's exactly why the Lithuanian Prime Minister, Inga Ruginiana, she's already convened the National Security Commission. They're discussing what to do.
Right.
She's openly warned they might have to consider shutting the border with Belarus for longer. It just shows how this seemingly minor smuggling tactic can be sort of weaponized to force big political and economic choices.
Speaking of complex balancing acts, let's shift south. Turkey, a perfect example of a player trying to navigate between, well, 2 very different sides in the Gaza conflict.
Turkey's position is unique and, deeply contradictory. On one side, you've got the U.S. seeing some value there. President Trump, Vice President J.D. Vance, they seem to view President Erdogan pretty positively.
Trump put him in the front row for ceasefire talks.
Yeah.
Vance praised Turkey's constructive role.
Exactly. But then you look at Israel, totally different picture. PM Netanyahu has a, quote, much more negative opinion. He explicitly says no Turkish troops in any kind of international stabilization force.
Well, yeah, I mean, Erdogan called Netanyahu the butcher of Gaza and referred to Hamas as a liberation movement. Doesn't that risk Turkey's NATO standing? Or is their position just too strategic for consequences?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And the analysis seems to suggest pragmatism is winning out. Turkey has this advantage.
Oh.
It's a NATO member, okay, but it can also influence Hamas, and it can put indirect pressure on Netanyahu. Plus, don't underestimate their operational capacity. You see names like AFAD, that's their huge disaster agency, and the Turkish Red Crescent. These guys are world-class in humanitarian aid, logistics, reconstruction. They know how to do this stuff.
So the strategy seems to be Focus where you have influence, but avoid the big risks.
Pretty much. Experts reckon Ankara will stick mainly to humanitarian and logistical stuff in Gaza, getting involved politically or militarily. Too risky. Too many potential fault lines, disagreements with Egypt, how the U.S. Congress feels about Erdogan.
Right. Congress is always a factor there.
Always.
Yeah.
So they want the influence, they want a seat at the table, absolutely. But they seem to be drawing a clear line before it gets, physically risky for their international standing.
Okay, that kind of cautious pragmatism, it actually leads us nicely into part 2. The economic costs of populism. And we have to look at Argentina. President Javier Milei's radical free market reforms, his whole austerity package, it's facing a massive test right now with legislative elections.
Yeah, this is textbook high-stakes policy. And the backdrop is dramatic. Remember that financial lifeline Milei got from the U.S.?
Currency swap.
Exactly.
Yeah.
$20 million from President Trump, basically a massive loan guarantee, with a promise of another $20 billion from private banks. But crucially, it was conditional.
Conditional on what?
Conditional on Milei not losing these elections to, quote, socialists or communists.
Oh, okay. So political ideology is literally bankrolling the economic experiment. But let's talk about the actual policy causing the pain. Milei capped the peso exchange rate, right? Trying to instantly kill triple-digit inflation.
Yeah.
What happened?
What happened was a brutal recession. By artificially fixing the peso's value, he made it way too strong, way too expensive compared to the dollar.
Right.
Because exports just stopped dead, consumption collapsed. He basically traded inflation control for, well, export paralysis and economic stagnation.
And the numbers. They was just horrific. Between late 2023 and mid-2025, something like 18,000 businesses closed. Over 250,000 registered jobs gone.
Yeah, and the welfare cuts hit hard, too. Universities, public hospitals, pensioners. They've been gutted. It's not just a recession. It was a specific choice that overnight made Argentina the most expensive country in South America.
I read that quote from a textile industrialist saying his family company is facing the worst moment in its history.
And Miley's trapped now, you see. If he devalues the peso, inflation goes through the roof again. If he keeps the cap, the recession just gets deeper and deeper. There's no easy way out.
That really sets the stage for looking at populist economics more broadly, doesn't it? All the crises we've had, 2008, COVID, Ukraine, it feels like they created this fertile ground for leaders offering simple, anti-establishment answers, especially when living standards aren't improving for many people.
Absolutely. And their economic plans, they're all over the map. You contrast Miley's radical, laissez-faire thing, privatize everything, scrap tariffs with someone like Trump.
Right. Trump had tax cuts for the wealthy, sure, but also much more interventionist stuff, trade policy, taking stakes in strategic companies.
Exactly. Different flavors of populism. And you see that tension playing out here in the UK, too, with Nigel Farage and the Reform Party. Their plan has this built-in contradiction.
How so?
Well, it's bankrolled by wealthy people who want deregulation, tax cuts, classic free market stuff. But to win votes from the working-class base, they promise things like reopening old steelworks using British coal.
Can you actually do both? Appease the free market funders and the old industrial base? It sounds like a tough balancing act.
It is. And that's exactly what makes the markets nervous. Remember the Truss mini budget?
Oh, yeah. Chaos.
Right. Economists keep warning. Huge tax giveaways without a proper funding plan. The markets will, quote, puke. And Farage seems to have gotten that message, actually. He backed off that huge $90 billion tax cut promise, started talking more about spending cuts instead.
Interesting. So the market risk is real. All this kind of feeds into what academics have found about populist rule long term, right? There was that big study.
Yeah, they looked at 51 populist leaders going way back from 1900 to 2020. And the conclusion,
I love it.
The long-term cost is pretty clear. On average, after 15 years under a populist leader, GDP per head tends to be 10% lower. 10%. Compared to similar countries with more mainstream governments.
Wow. That's a significant hit. 10% lower GDP per person.
It is. But here's the kicker.
Go on.
Despite that long-term damage, these leaders are politically resilient. They last, on average, 8 years in power, double the typical 4 years for their more moderate counterparts.
8 years versus 4, so the economic pain doesn't necessarily translate into losing power quickly.
Exactly. The reckoning, economically speaking, seems to be delayed or maybe even disconnected from the leader's political survival for quite a while.
Okay, well, that brings us to our final segment, linking policy directly back to, consumer prices and also accountability.
Yeah.
Let's bring it home to the UK, to the grocery store, basically.
Right. Supermarket bosses here have put out a direct warning. They're saying a proposed government tax, a surtax on business rates, could push food prices even higher.
Okay, what's this tax specifically?
It targets large commercial properties, anything with a rateable value of £500,000 or more. Supermarkets argue that even though these big stores are a, quote, tiny proportion of all stores, they actually pay about a third of all the business rates in the retail sector.
A third? Wow, okay.
Yeah, so their argument is simple. Chancellor, reduce the overall rates burden if you want to tackle this stubbornly high food inflation. They're putting the pressure back on the government.
Makes sense. What's the Treasury saying?
Well, the Treasury's defense is a bit technical. They say they'll adjust the overall rate system so it raises the same amount of money in real terms. They argue if the total value of all properties goes up, the tax rate might actually fall, meaning an individual supermarket's bill could still go down.
Could. It sounds a bit like smoke and mirrors, designed to confuse people about whether prices will actually go up or not.
It's certainly not a straightforward picture for the consumer trying to figure out their grocery bill.
Okay. And finally, let's turn to accountability. Specifically in the humanitarian aid sector, there's been a significant update. The arrest of that charity boss who was identified in the BBC's Sex for Aid investigation.
Yes, a really important development. And the details that came out about his denial tactics, they're pretty startling.
What did he say?
Well, he tried to discredit the women who accused him, Medina, Nada, Batul, and others, basically by saying there weren't enough of them. He actually said, if you said 100, 200 had accused me, then fine, then you could believe I actually did those things.
That's an unbelievable argument, setting this impossible bar based on the sheer scale of aid operations.
Exactly. It felt like trying to weaponize the system against the victims.
Yeah.
Then he tried a specific medical defense. He claimed sexual activity was, quote, not possible for him because he had an operation back in 2016 to remove his left testicle.
Okay. But is that medically sound?
Apparently not. A professor of urology and expert in men's sexual health directly contradicted him. Said explicitly that having one testicle removed doesn't affect someone's sex life. But the accused just insisted, not possible for me, despite that medical opinion.
Quite a defense. Well, what a range we've covered today.
Yeah.
Seriously. From claims of, infinite range nuclear missiles and the sheer complexity of Turkey's geopolitical maneuvering.
All the way down to the really granular level of economic pain in Buenos Aires, the cost of groceries right here, and even, bizarrely, those cigarette balloons grounding flights.
Yeah. And the core tension just seems so clear across all these different stories, doesn't it? It's this constant conflict between the political spectacle, Milei's radical image, Putin's claims of invulnerability, and then the hard, tangible reality hitting markets and ordinary people.
Exactly. Whether that reality is a deep recession, soaring commodity prices, or, your flight being canceled because of a balloon, the spectacle clashes with the lived experience.
So what does this all mean?
That's the big question, isn't it?
I guess. Here's something to chew on. We know from the research that populist leaders, like the ones in Argentina right now, often cause real long-term economic damage, right?
Yeah.
That 10% lower GDP figure. But we also know they tend to stick around politically for much longer than others. So when you add in external financial intervention like that massive $20 billion lifeline the U.S. gave Argentina, how does that ultimately change things? Does it just delay the economic reckoning for ordinary people, the ones dealing with the inflation and job losses day to day? Or does it make it worse in the long run?
A very pertinent question. Does the lifeline prop up the politics while the economic reality keeps deteriorating underneath?
Something to think about. Definitely. Especially as these global pressure points just seem to keep multiplying.